a loving father of two.
Era muy buen padre, la verdad.
He was extremely hardworking, very likable, very personable.
Is ruthlessly killed outside his home.
There was numerous gunshot wounds to his upper torso.
Whoever shot the victim was extremely angry and was sending a message.
Detectives hunt a cold-blooded murderer.
We identified the weapon as an AK-47.
We received a text message that said, "Nobody messes with me."
People were fearing for their lives because the killer was still out there.
The question starts to creep in of, is this one that may never be solved?
Then, one phone call changes everything.
He said that he was in fear for his life, for what he was going to tell us.
We thought, wow, this is the first break that we've had.
Exposing a killer no one saw coming.
It hit you in the gut. It was somebody that you just never really would have expected.
Le quitó un padre y a mí la mitad de mi corazón.
Mammoth Lakes, California, a pristine ski town in the Sierra Nevada mountains.
People come out here to vacation. They come out here to go skiing, snowboarding, and in the summer months, it's hiking, bicycling, fishing.
It's beautiful. The weather's always sunny. There's always an outdoor aspect that is just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen.
One early fall morning in 2016 turns into a nightmare for the town of Mammoth.
Mammoth Lakes Police Department received a 911 call at approximately 1:50 in the morning, reporting just hearing a series of rapid gunfire and that a neighbor across the street had been shot.
Police and first responders raced to the scene.
Patrol officers found the victim lying in the driveway, and he was lying face down in his own blood.
You had an individual who'd been shot multiple times and the victim's wife standing there, and she's hysterical.
Y yo quise abrazar a Omar, me acuerdo. Y alguien dijo, no lo toques, no lo toques. Yo le dije, pero ¿y por qué no? Si es mi esposo. Quiero saber que él esté bien.
Paramedics arrive and try to resuscitate the victim.
La ambulancia llegó rápido, pero como Omar recibió muchos disparos en el cuerpo, Omar ya había muerto cuando ellos llegaron.
Police learn the victim is 35-year-old Omar Hernandez, and a homicide investigation is launched.
When I arrived on scene, I've never seen anything like that. Omar had approximately 15 gunshot wounds to his body.
There were bullet impact marks all over. In total, there was 30 shell casings that were found.
The victim was laying alongside his vehicle. There was numerous gunshot wounds to his upper torso. His vehicle was still running, coffee cup still laying there, all indications that he was getting ready to go somewhere.
What was also noticed was there were divots that were in the asphalt and in the driveway.
We definitely got the feeling that as the victim laid there, he was continuously being shot.
I felt like it was extremely personal. Whoever shot the victim was extremely angry and was sending a message.
The shell casings provide another surprising but valuable clue.
The caliber of the bullet that was used, that only comes from a high-powered assault rifle.
It was a 7.6 millimeter round, so we believed it had to be an AK-47. To have a weapon of that sort here in Mammoth, I thought was extremely unusual because those are assault weapons. Those are not hunting rifles.
We thought it was potentially gang-related, possibly some sort of hit that somebody definitely wanted to get the job done.
Could this have been a planned execution? Detectives try to speak with Omar's wife, Gladys.
Gladys was hysterical, extremely upset, unable to talk, and she was screaming.
Estaba devastada por mi dolor, devastada por el dolor de saber que Omar había muerto. Y estaba pues perdida porque decía, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué le hicieron esto a Omar?
Born in 1980, Omar was raised by a single mother in Guadalajara, Mexico, but knew his destiny lay elsewhere.
El sueño de Omar era exacto venir a Estados Unidos porque sabía que aquí había más oportunidades, Su visión era crecer, salir adelante y sacar adelante a su mamá.
When Omar was 18 years old, he headed to Mammoth on the advice of a friend, and for 8 years had been successfully working his way up at the same company.
Omar had a good job here in Mammoth. He was a supervisor at the Vaughn's grocery store, which is the main grocery store in Mammoth Lakes.
He was extremely hardworking, very likable, very personable.
At work, Omar was known to be a kind and caring, almost big brother figure to a lot of the employees that he supervised. He took them under his wing and really tried to help them feel like they belonged.
In 2006, Omar met Gladys Gastelum, and romance quickly blossomed.
Lo conocí y amor a primera vista. Sentí que era una gran persona, un hombre increíble.
Omar and Gladys started a family, welcoming the arrival of 2 sons.
Omar, como padre, era fantástico. Era muy, muy buen padre, la verdad.
The young family had a bright future, starting with an event planned for just days after Omar's murder.
Venía toda mi familia de México. Íbamos a bautizar a Mateo. Yo estaba emocionada por el bautizo de mi hijo y porque venía toda mi familia.
Instead of a celebration, Omar's loved ones must now organize a funeral. Looking for answers, detectives questioned Gladys about the hours leading up to the shooting.
She had gone to visit a family member, and Omar stayed home, and she came home right around 10 or 10:30 p.m. that night, and Omar was sleeping.
He was trying to get a good night's sleep before the night shift.
According to Gladys, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, Omar had gotten up, made himself some coffee, and went outside to start the car, to warm it up.
Omar siempre entraba a despedirse y me dio un beso y me dijo, te amo.
And then shortly after he exited the back door to go to work, she heard the loud gunfire that made her jump up.
Se escucha una ráfaga de muchos disparos y yo me paro asustada. Yo nada más pedí a Dios que no fueran para Omar, que cuidara a Omar porque iba saliendo de mi casa.
So she got dressed really quick, ran outside, and that's when she saw Omar lying face down in the driveway.
Y empiezo a gritar ayuda, por ayuda, ayuda, ayuda. Y le dije al vecino, llama al 911, porque Omar no está bien, algo le hicieron a Omar. Le dije, le dispararon a Omar.
When police ask if anyone held a grudge against Omar, Gladys's response is immediate.
The name of Saul Morales came up. Saul Morales had a problem with Omar because Saul had always accused Omar of having an extramarital affair with his wife, Rosalinda, who was also an employee at the Vaughn's supermarket.
About a year or so before the murder occurred, investigators learned that Saul had actually gone to Omar and Gladys's home trying to confront Omar over whether these affair rumors were true.
There were disputes between Omar and Saul.
Gladys tells investigators that Saul's behavior had been disturbing.
Saul had confronted her, told her that my wife is having an affair with your husband.
She noticed that he had been driving by the house on a regular basis.
Gladys says she had seen Saul drive by her house as recently as just 3 days before Omar was killed. Things became so bad, Gladys tells police that Omar filed a restraining order against Saul.
That was an attempt for Omar to get Saul to stop coming to his house, stop contacting his wife.
Could Saul's jealous rage have driven him to murder?
Gladys indicated that she was afraid of Saul, and she thought maybe he was so upset over this alleged affair that he possibly could have killed Omar.
And so Saul became a person of interest pretty quickly. At that moment, we felt like, okay, maybe this is the guy.
Coming up, investigators uncover a menacing grudge.
He hated Omar,
He was there to teach Omar a lesson.
not his motive to murder somebody.
and shocking clues.
The sedan pulled over near where the crime scene occurred.
It was the same vehicle that we'd seen in the video surveillance.
The shell casings recovered were fired from the same gun.
Before a surprise confession reveals a cold-blooded killer.
He described how he just continued to shoot.
Nunca imaginé que él hubiera hecho algo tan desgarrador, algo tan triste.
That was alarming. I knew right then it was huge.
Hours after 35-year-old father of two, Omar Hernandez, was gunned down in his own driveway, his wife Gladys has pointed police towards a possible killer.
Saul Morales was the first suspect in this case because his wife, Rosalinda, had reportedly been having an affair with Omar.
We found out that Saul confronted Omar about the affair.
Saul told Omar to leave his wife alone.
Omar was upset that Saul had come over to his house while his kids were home.
There was a fight that broke out between them and police were called.
Officers arrived on scene and they were separated. No charges were filed, but there still was a documented incident. Gladys did not believe that Omar really did have an affair with Rosalinda. But the important thing was if Saul believed it to be true, then that is motive to murder somebody.
Needing more information about the alleged affair, investigators head to Omar's workplace.
The coworkers described Omar as a nice guy, got along with everybody.
The manager described Omar as a very hardworking person dedicated to the job, was that employee that worked over and beyond what was required of him.
The manager did tell me that he had heard the rumors about Rosalinda and Omar's extramarital relationship. And also, he did bring up the fact that at times he would see Saul in Vaughn's walking through the aisles as though he wanted to catch Omar and Rosalinda together.
Learning Saul's wife, Rosalinda, happens to be working her shift at the store, detectives pull her aside for an interview.
She was very, very emotional.
Rosalinda found out about the murder when she came in to work and became very upset.
Investigators confront Rosalinda about the rumors.
Rosalinda denied that there was ever an affair or that there was any sexual relations between her and Omar.
She said that her and Omar's relationship was purely platonic and that her and him had been best friends, and that's the extent of their relationship.
Rosalinda definitely gave me the sense that she was nervous.
In talking to Rosalinda, she appeared to be holding back.
At this point, investigators weren't sure whether the affair was a rumor or whether it was true.
It seemed like the jealousy involved in the case could have been enough for murder. When you see a murder that gruesome, with that many bullets and that much violence, it comes out of some strong emotion.
Police know that even if Saul had motive for murder, he also needed the opportunity.
We asked Rosalinda where Saul was the previous night, and Rosalinda said that Saul was in bed with her the whole night, and then she ended up getting up for work around 3 that morning, and he was still in bed.
I wouldn't say that that particular alibi was rock solid, so interviewing him was very important, just to find out if their stories matched.
Investigators bring Saul down to the station.
When I interviewed Saul, he was extremely calm, extremely courteous, and extremely cooperative.
He was very forthcoming about the altercations that had occurred with Omar in the past, and that he was afraid that Omar had had an affair with his wife.
Investigators ask Saul to account for his movements in the hours leading up to the murder.
Saul claimed that he had gone to visit his uncle, and he was with his uncle throughout the night before coming home, and went to bed right around 11 o'clock that evening.
He said that he was asleep in his bed on the night of the murder and had nothing to do with it. He voluntarily provided a DNA reference sample to exclude him.
Getting DNA from Saul was extremely important because he was a prime suspect in the shooting. And because with fingerprints coming off the bullet casings, you could match the DNA.
Saul also allows detectives to search his home.
I searched the house for weapons, ammunition, or any evidence that could tie him to the crime. But I never found anything that would lead me to believe he had weapons or ammunition in the house.
When the results come in, Saul's DNA does not match the DNA found on the spent shell casings.
His story seemed to be making sense. It seemed to be consistent. There was no indicators that he was lying to us.
And so we didn't have anything to really move on.
I didn't find him to be suspicious. He just wasn't connecting the dots for me. And from my training and experience, he did not give me any indication that he was involved in the shooting. And so that was really frustrating.
With detectives forced to put Saul on the back burner, they revisit the theory that Omar's murder could have been a professional hit.
The weapon used, the AK-47, it's a weapon of murder, a weapon of violence. And so the nature of that weapon alone made people think this has something to do with a gang.
Because of the brutal nature of the crime, something we were looking at, is this the cartel? Is this a paid hit? It's gotta be big because of the way it was done.
Police investigating the ruthless shooting of Omar Hernandez outside his home in Mammoth Lakes, California, now suspect he might have been targeted by a criminal gang.
There was speculation that maybe this was a drug deal that went bad and the cartel had come up and put a hit on Omar. Investigators went looking through Omar's background to see if there was any drug affiliations or anything that could have been tied to organized crime.
I didn't find anything in Omar's background that would indicate he had any gang association whatsoever.
No pertenecía a pandillas, él era una persona tranquila, no usaba drogas, no usaba nada.
Investigators move on from the gangland hit theory. Several days later, they discover their security camera footage from a building near Omar's home and hope the video will provide new leads.
The closest camera that had any video surveillance was several hundred yards down the street, so you were capturing vehicles coming and going.
Unfortunately, there were no cameras that were able to actually capture the crime as it occurred.
What the security footage documented was a vehicle circling the area several times prior to the shooting.
We had what we believed was a light-colored four-door sedan. We felt pretty confident that it was a Toyota Camry or Toyota Corolla. We felt like that vehicle possibly was involved.
Police spot another suspicious vehicle in the footage.
There was a red sedan-type vehicle that was seen at the intersection driving down towards the victim residence.
What was notable was it appeared less than 2 minutes prior to when the murder took place, and then the sedan pulled over near where the crime scene occurred.
Unfortunately, with the low image quality, we weren't able to identify who was in the suspect vehicles.
Undeterred, police show the footage to Omar's wife, hoping she can identify the vehicles. The red sedan provokes a strong reaction.
Gladys said that the day after the shooting, a red sedan drove by with two people inside of it that she recognized as Vaughn's employees. She did say that they gave her a slow roll type of look, as though letting her know they were watching her, or maybe even they were involved.
Sentí miedo en ese momento porque cuando ellos pasan manejando y luego le hacen así, yo sentí mucho temor, sentí miedo.
Gladys told investigators that the two individuals in the car were Jose Antonio Carreras Vasquez and Eliud Carreras Vasquez. They were cousins. Gladys knew Eliud and Jose Antonio as co-workers of Omar's.
At the time, their reputation was that they were MS-13 gang members from El Salvador.
Detectives head to Vaughn's to talk with Jose Antonio and Eliud's co-workers.
Employees did tell me that Omar was the supervisor for the Salvadorians, and it appeared that they didn't like Omar, they didn't like taking orders from him.
Investigators learned that Omar had been promoted to a management position a few months before his murder, and that there was constant friction between him and Eliud.
Eliud and Omar did not get along. In fact, there had actually been an incident between the two of them where Eliud had been sent home for not doing his job properly.
Eliud became so upset that he contacted the union and made a formal complaint against Omar.
Did Eliud take matters into his own hands with deadly consequences? There's one more detail about him that raises suspicions.
Eliud drove a red sedan, and it seemed to be a possible match to the car that was on the surveillance video. However, when we looked closer at the red sedan and Eliud's red sedan, it was clear immediately that they did not match, and that was not Eliud's car in that surveillance video.
With Eliud looking less likely as the killer, investigators turn their focus to his cousin, Jose Antonio.
He claimed to have some association to some gangs. We subsequently served a search warrant at his residence. We did find assault weapons, although they ended up being imitation airsoft type weapons. So obviously they weren't involved in the actual murder itself.
We didn't find any definitive ties to Salvadorian gangs. I think it was just their bravado, and they had a heavy reputation, and they knew people were afraid of them.
Without anything concrete linking Jose Antonio or Eliud to Omar's death, detectives are forced to move on.
That was just super frustrating. It just seemed like at every corner there was something that we thought was going to really point us in the right direction and really break the case open for us, and it just was another dead end.
Just as the case threatens to hit a wall, investigators scouring Omar's cell phone activity make a jaw-dropping discovery.
In combing through thousands and thousands of text messages, we did find many text messages where he and Rosalinda spoke to each other, and it became very clear that the rumors of the affair were definitely true. It also became apparent that not only was there an affair with Rosalinda, but that Gladys knew about the affair.
That was a cause for concern because initially the affair was denied by all parties at first when the investigation began.
The texts force investigators to rethink everything. Why did Gladys and Rosalinda lie? Were either of them trying to cover up for a crime? And had Saul learned the truth and done the unthinkable?
There was a lot of evidence that showed that there were enough emotional ties involved in that somebody could be angry enough to kill someone based off of that infidelity.
Weeks have passed since father of two, Omar Hernandez, was brutally gunned down. Detectives have just obtained proof a rumored affair between Omar and coworker Rosalinda did actually take place.
Omar was involved romantically with Rosalinda, and through cell phone forensics, we located text messages that definitely confirmed that Omar had a conversation with Gladys as well about the affair that confirmed that she knew about it.
Gladys had previously told police there was nothing to the rumored affair, so investigators had to speak to her again.
When we asked Gladys about the affair, she broke down crying, and she confirmed the rumors to be true.
Gladys described how she found out about the affair with Rosalinda back in 2014. She had returned home early from a trip to Mexico, and when she came back to their house, Omar wasn't there, but there was burned wax and rose petals on the bed, on the floor around it, and she knew they weren't for her. So a couple days after, she ended up going through her husband's phone and found the text messages between Omar and Rosalinda, which confirmed to her that he had had an affair.
Detectives asked Gladys why she lied to them before. What was she trying to hide?
Her reasoning behind lying about the affair was simply to protect Omar's reputation. He had a good reputation, and she wanted to maintain that. And also, according to Gladys, they were working through their problems to keep their family together.
She just didn't want to have anything negative to say about her husband. He'd been brutally murdered. She kind of wanted to leave it at that. Let's investigate and try to figure out the person responsible.
Police are also curious why Rosalinda had been untruthful and bring her into the station.
And told her we knew that she did have an affair with Omar. She told us that she lied because she was embarrassed about it, but also that she didn't want to inflame things with Saul.
We asked her whether he knew about the affair or not. She confirmed that he did know about it. She was definitely concerned about her husband.
I asked her flat out if she believed that Saul may have killed Omar, and her answer to my question was, I don't believe he pulled the trigger. So of course that was alarming. I thought maybe I missed something at the beginning and that there was a potential that Saul may have actually even hired someone to kill Omar. It presents difficulty because then you have to backtrack and look at the initial suspect once again and make sure you haven't overlooked anything.
Investigators re-look at Saul, but after combing through phone records and text, find no evidence he hired anyone to kill Omar or that he committed the crime himself.
At this point, the evidence did not bear fruit that Saul was the suspect we were looking for. His alibi checked out. There was nothing else that ever came up that pointed him as being the one who did this.
Saul is cleared once again. With yet another busted lead and no arrest in sight, police have to contend with the fear that's gripping Mammoth Lakes.
It was pretty hard for the community to have all these investigations going on and talk of murder and gossip of violence and the things that led to it, but no answers, just dead ends. I think people genuinely were fearing for their lives because the killer was still out there.
Afectó a la comunidad porque todos vivían en pánico, porque todos se preguntaban ¿por qué pasó esto? ¿Por qué en un pueblo tan chico, donde nunca había pasado nada así? No había explicación y pienso que la gente sí tuvo miedo.
Despite months of tireless work, investigators run out of leads.
The case essentially went cold. There was nothing to indicate any one person was responsible.
At this point, we're well over a year into the investigation, and the question starts to creep in of, is this one that may never be solved? It starts to weigh on you because we've formed relationships with Gladys and we want nothing more than to bring justice for her family.
It definitely wears on you as an investigator. You constantly ask yourself, what did I miss? There's got to be something there that I missed.
Fue uno de los puntos más difíciles para mí también. Pero siempre tuve fe de que algún día, dije, así pasen años, se va a solucionar porque no puede quedar la muerte de Omar impune. De esa manera como él murió, no puede quedar así.
We had always been feeling that if we could just get that one piece of information that could lead us to the suspect, we'll develop the rest. But we needed somebody to come forward and give us a break that we needed to solve that case.
2.5 years later, detectives receive just that. An explosive phone call that upends the whole case.
In June 2019, a person called and said that they know who killed Omar and has some concerns for their own safety.
In my mind, I felt that that's the big break that we needed. Sometimes that's all it is, one person with information. I knew right then it was huge.
2.5 years since the brutal slaying of Omar Hernandez, an informant has come forward with information that blows the case wide open.
A man by the name of Francisco Ramirez came into our office, and you could tell that something was scaring him. He said that he was in fear for his life, for what he was going to tell us. Francisco started telling us about this individual. His name was Josue Correas Vasquez, and he was a co-worker at Vaughn's. They both worked the night shift.
Francisco worked with Josue, and Josue was actually the brother to Eliud, and he describes this contentious relationship between Omar and Eliud and Josue. Months before the murder, says that they were constantly butting heads with one another, described Eliud and Josue as constantly disrespecting Omar. Omar would delegate tasks that need to be completed, and Eliud and Josue would always be disrespectful and say, well, why do we got to do that? Nah, I don't think so. Was just constantly kind of challenging him.
Josue had actually told Francisco that he hated Omar because he had been disrespected and that he had threatened to fire his whole family, and that he had to take matters into his own hands. Then, just several hours after the murder had occurred, Francisco told us that he received a text message from Josue, and it said something to the effect of, "See, I'm not playing around." And then there was another text message that said, "Nobody messes with me."
When he saw the text message, he felt very strongly that that is Josue's way of telling him he just murdered Omar.
Francisco then divulges another disturbing piece of information.
Francisco told us that he had actually gone shooting with Josue months prior to the murder. They had gone out in the middle of the forest, and that Josue had brought an AK-47 with him and were just shooting targets. When Francisco mentioned AK-47, obviously all of our ears perked up, as that's the weapon we were looking for.
And then several years after Omar was murdered, Francisco became the manager to take Omar's place at Vaughn's. And he's now in a position to where he needs to delegate, and he's now seeing the same disrespectful tone from Josue. At some point in time, he and Josue got into an argument, and Josue says something to the effect of, "Don't make me do to you what I did to Omar."
We asked Francisco why he is now just coming forward 2.5 years after the murder. And Francisco said that he was scared of Josue.
He was concerned for his safety, and he wanted to tell law enforcement about what he knew, because he said, if something is to happen to me, I want you guys to know who's responsible.
Francisco realized, I could be the one that's next, and this guy needs to be stopped.
Detectives contact Gladys to gather more information about the working relationship between Omar and Josue.
Gladys did tell us that when Josue first came to the States, he didn't have a lot of friends, he didn't know very many people, and Omar had taken Josue under his wing.
Omar was kind to him, would bring him food for lunch breaks, really seemed to keep an eye on Josue and care about his well-being.
Siempre le ponía su lunch para que él comiera en Bonds, y siempre me decía, oye Gladys, échale más lunch para convivir, para darle a Josue.
Omar and Josue seemed to get along for many months during that time period. But Gladys told us that once Omar was promoted to supervisor, things started to change between Omar and Josue.
Cuando a Omar le dan el puesto, sí sentía que algo había cambiado. La misma relación de amistad ya no era igual.
Omar had a job to do, and as Omar started giving more direction and instructions to Josue, Josue started to be a bit more belligerent towards him, talking back, refusing to do certain things.
There had been reported conflicts between the two, and that Josue had felt like Omar was on a power trip.
They didn't get along at work. They were constantly arguing with one another.
Could a workplace conflict have turned into murder? Investigators pull the employee timesheets for the night Omar was killed.
We went back through the Vaughn's records from that night to see when people clocked in, and we noticed that Josue did not work at all that night. We also looked into what vehicle does Josue drive.
Detectives are hopeful that Josue's car will be a match to one of the two vehicles spotted in the surveillance footage.
We determined that at the time of the murder in 2016, he did in fact own a 2012 silver Toyota Camry. That vehicle, shortly after the murder, had been resold to another individual. So we ended up finding that vehicle down in another part of California, and it was the same vehicle that we'd seen in the video surveillance.
It matched the color and the make and model of what we were looking for.
At that moment, we felt that we had the person responsible for the murder of Omar.
Needing hard evidence to tie Josue to the murder, detectives head to the area where Francisco had witnessed him firing an AK-47.
It wasn't a designated shooting range. It was a dirt road off of a main highway.
We went out to the range where he said that he shot with Josue, and we were actually able to recover 56 cartridges that were just below the dirt. All of these cartridges were extremely important because as we grabbed the first cartridge we saw, it had the same head stamp of the cartridges found at the murder scene. When we found shell casings, it just really hit you in the gut.
We thought, wow, this is the first break that we've had.
Two and a half years after Omar Hernandez was murdered, investigators hope they finally got a break after discovering spent bullet casings that appear to match those recovered from the crime scene.
We found north of 50 expended projectiles in the dirt and sent those casings back to the laboratory for comparison.
After we compared the two casings together, one from the murder scene and one from the shooting range, the lab told us that they were fired from the same gun.
This was huge in an investigation. We have an identified suspect and we have physical evidence.
On January 30th, 2020, Josue Correa Vasquez is arrested for Omar's murder.
After Josue was arrested, we brought him in for an interview. We knew that the shell casings recovered at the crime scene were the same as the shooting range. What we didn't have was a way to tie that in to Josue. So what we decided to do was create a fake DNA profile that would be shown to Josue, and what it said was that we recovered DNA from the shell casings and that it matched somebody of the same age and ethnicity as Josue. The goal of having the DNA profile was in hopes that it would push Josue to tell the truth.
Detectives also use another tactic and make an emotional appeal.
Investigator Callahan actually had a photograph of Omar's children on his desk.
I showed him the kids and I said, these kids, they don't deserve what happened to them. Let's try to give them some closure. They have no father. They just want answers. They want to know.
Josue stuns investigators with what he says next.
No importa, pero los niños sí. Ese día, como cuando ya el odio ya lo invade y ya siente este día lo voy a hacer.
There was a lot of hate against Omar for my part, and that's why me alone decided to kill him.
It was a monumental moment that we felt, okay, we've got the right guy.
The question remains, why would Josue commit such a heinous crime?
Josue told us he hated Omar. He hated that he would tell him how to do his job. He hated that he'd be tough on him.
He felt that he was disrespected by Omar, and he was there to teach Omar a lesson.
Josue proceeds to tell investigators what happened that fatal night.
You knew that Omar was going to work at 2 in the morning?
He said that he drove by Omar's residence a number of times, confirmed that the vehicle in the video surveillance was in fact his vehicle.
He says he went around the block to see if he was home.
Just before 2 a.m., Josue parked across the street from Omar's home, and he waited for him to come out.
He saw Omar come out of his residence, and that was the moment that he'd been waiting for. He grabbed the AK-47. When Omar went to the driver's side of the door to leave, Josue emerged from the trees and yelled at him, "You don't look so invincible now, do you?" and described shooting him several times.
Eso fue lo que le dijo, que no era invencible. Parí que no era invencible.
He described the look in Omar's face, the surprise, the shock.
How many times did you shoot?
Era mucho el odio. Le disparé todo el cartucho. Como al tercer disparo ya cayó.
¿Y seguiste disparando? And he kept firing.
Josue said that after he murdered Omar, he went home, he went to bed. A lot of Josue's interview is matter of fact, which was chilling in and of itself, that you can have murdered somebody and just be talking about it in such an unemotional way.
Josue admits that several days after killing Omar, he told his brother Eliud what he had done.
Eliud was concerned about the murder weapon and whether it could be traced back to Josue. So Eliud took it upon himself to take the AK-47 to the forest and bury it so no one would ever be able to find it.
Based on Josue's confession, police bring in Eliud.
He eventually admitted to us that he did help dispose of the gun and gave us the details about where it was, and he pointed to the exact location where the firearm would be recovered.
So we dug right there and sure enough found an AK-47.
At this point, it's kind of a prosecutor's dream. We have a confession statement from the defendant, and the murder weapon that we never thought we would recover just showed up.
For his part in the crime, Eliud is sentenced to a year in jail.
Eliud was charged as being an accessory after the fact. He was charged for helping dispose of the murder weapon and not telling authorities about it.
On January 18th, 2022, Josue is sentenced to 2 life terms in prison for the murder of Omar Hernandez.
El día de la sentencia sentí paz porque se estaba haciendo justicia de la muerte de Omar. Nunca imaginé que Josue hubiera hecho eso, tan desgarrador, algo tan triste.
The biggest surprise was that it was somebody that you just never really would have expected. Omar had taken Josue under his wing. By all accounts, Omar cared very much about Josue.
That's what was so troubling in this case. Omar lost his life, was brutally murdered for no reason other than he was a hardworking individual who had expectations.
A mis hijos les quitó un padre y a mí la mitad de mi corazón. Eso nos arrancó Josue.
Omar's family still feels the deep impact of his loss.
Sé que desde el cielo Él me da esas fuerzas. Yo que lo recuerdo mucho en el momento de que donde yo necesito recargar mi cabeza en su hombro, donde ocupo el abrazo que me diga, todo va a estar bien, Gladys, no te preocupes, y que me haga así. Esos momentos extraño mucho de él.
A loving mother with a selfless spirit.
I remember her laughter. You could hear Mother laughing from 2 rooms away.
She was really representative of the goodness in people. She loved her community. They loved her.
Is stabbed to death in a horrifying attack.
It was gruesome crime scene. There was a lot of blood.
Perpetrator left the victim with a 2-pronged serving fork sticking out of her throat.
The amount of devastation led us to believe that it definitely was a crime of passion.
Suspicion falls on those closest to her.
He was the husband that last saw her alive. He didn't really show any signs of grieving.
He failed the polygraph.
My first thought was that it was a domestic assault.
Her son had had an argument with his mother that morning.
A neighbor had seen a teenager running away from the home that day.
Months go by without an arrest.
We kept wondering, why is it so hard to capture a murderer in this small town?
Then, just as the case is in danger of going cold, police uncover a dire warning.
The note threatened more violence
that leads to a deranged killer no one could have predicted.
Wow, we didn't see that coming.
Shenandoah, Iowa is a close-knit farming community home to just 5,500 people.
Shenandoah is your typical small town. It's just beautiful. The corn surrounding the towns. Everybody knows one another. You just are almost shocked at how nice folks are.
It's a small, peaceful community. People know their neighbors, take care of each other. You don't have a lot of violent crime of any nature.
The peace is shattered on September 6, 1988, when police get a disturbing call from local pastor Robert Borton at 3:40 p.m. He tells police his wife of 19 years, Cindy, is dead.
He found her body in the kitchen, lying in a pool of her own blood. He called authorities, who arrived immediately and kept him outside of the house.
It was gruesome crime scene. We found a female on the kitchen floor. There was a lot of blood everywhere. This person had been stabbed many, many times.
The perpetrator left the victim lying on her back in a pool of blood with a two-pronged serving fork sticking out of her throat. That image stayed with me because it was remarkable in its gruesomeness. There were 4 instruments that appeared to come from her kitchen that were weapons of convenience for the killer.
There were 2 forks, a large 2-pronged fork, a 4-pronged fork, as well as 2 knives. There was a struggle. There were some cuts on her hand where she had fought the person and she had tried to get away from the person. The phone had been ripped off of the wall, and it was obvious that a lot of activity went on while Cindy was being killed.
Detectives observed that the pool of blood is not yet dry, meaning the murder likely happened in the late morning or early afternoon.
In addition to the blood in the kitchen, there were also some blood stains found in the bathroom.
It was obvious that the person had cleaned up in the bathroom because there wasn't any visible pools of blood, just blood that looked like it had been washed off of hands or clothing. We did not have the benefit of DNA testing back in the 80s. Blood would have been collected still because you can type the blood, and that was what was one thing that we'd be looking at. And of course, fingerprints obviously throughout the crime scene.
There was no forced entry. We were 99% sure that she knew who the perpetrator was. My first thought was that it was a family assault.
The amount of devastation that was there at the crime scene led us to believe that it definitely was a crime of passion.
Detectives had to speak with Cindy's husband, Robert, but are beaten to it by a new arrival at the scene, the couple's 18-year-old son.
I seen an ambulance parked in front of my house, and my father was leaning against the front of my mother's car crying, and I just knew deep down inside me that my world was never going to be the same. I dropped my backpack there in the middle of the yard and went running up to my father, and he then informed me that Mama was gone.
39-year-old Cynthia Borton was a born and bred Iowa girl. She and her brother were raised by loving parents just outside Des Moines.
My mother and my uncle would always tell me about the adventures that they had around the farm. Life was good for them. Everybody had to laugh, according to Mama. I remember her laughter. You could hear Mother laughing from 2 rooms away. You would have to rush in there to find out what it was that was so funny that made Mama laugh.
As a teen, Cindy worked at a local restaurant and soon after would meet her future husband.
My father wound up coming in there and doing the whole phone number exchange thing, and then they started going out, and one thing led to another.
The couple married in 1969. When the family moved to Shenandoah, Cindy had her hands full.
Mama just kind of assumed the role of the pastor's wife. She also worked at a donut place there. Mama always did what she had to do to take care of the family. I was her everything. I was very much a mama's boy. My mother was love personified.
Cindy's warm heart also extended to those outside the family.
Mama always had an open door policy for all of my friends. They always knew that my mother was there to be a second mother to them, somebody that they could talk to, that she never passed judgment on anybody. She was also very good with giving out the hugs. Mama was always there to give you a hand back up if life knocked you down.
Cindy loved her community. They loved her. She was really representative of a small town in Iowa, the goodness in people.
Cindy's death leaves many in the community wondering who could have killed her. Investigators have an idea on where to start.
Back in that time, about 85% of all homicides in the state of Iowa were committed by someone close to the victim. Husband is always a major suspect at the time we see a homicide like this, especially one with so much rage involved.
Robert was interviewed and gave the following timeline. He had gone to work that morning at Select Motors, where he was a part-time worker because preaching to a small rural congregation is not lucrative employment. Robert returned home at noon, as was his habit. His wife served him spaghetti for lunch, and at 1 o'clock he returned to work. Cindy worked at a local bakery. Her shift was to start at 2 o'clock that day. When she didn't show up for work, her employer became concerned and called Robert. He indicated that he thought perhaps she had simply taken a nap and overslept. Approximately an hour or so later, when she still had not shown up for work, he got the second phone call from his wife's employer. He went home at about 3:30 in the afternoon to discover Cindy dead on the kitchen floor.
What Robert says he did next raises a red flag to detectives.
After finding his wife and then calling to get some help, he took the dog out instead of, being there for his wife or trying to do something for his wife. He said he wanted it to be tied up so that the ambulance people wouldn't have to deal with his pets. That was very unusual and very strange.
Then, Robert offers up a theory investigators find completely ludicrous.
Bob was saying that his wife could have just tripped and fell onto this fork. That was totally not plausible. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just, I can't imagine anyone ending up in a situation, and certainly not with the amount of blood that was found there at the scene too.
He thought that it was an accident. And that really raised eyebrows. How could you possibly think that someone had just fallen? You just think, well, this is someone who snapped.
Bob Borton was our prime suspect immediately after the death of Cynthia Borton because, first of all, he was the last person to see her alive, and then he also was the one that found her.
Coming up, suspicion swells around Cindy's husband.
His work clothing was laundered before investigators had an opportunity to examine it for blood spatter.
What does Robert Borton have to hide?
The only thing I want him to say is, I did it.
While police dig for evidence against their top suspect, a threatening clue sends shockwaves through the town.
There were a great many different and wild rumors, leaving notes at the scene. Cynthia Borton ain't nothing compared to what's coming. And hints such as the NS Night Stalker.
This story just got even more crazy and more sensational and more scary.
Police in Shenandoah, Iowa are investigating the gruesome murder of 39-year-old Cynthia Borton. Her husband Robert's erratic behavior is putting him in detective spotlight.
Robert commented that his wife had simply fallen on a serving fork and died an accidental death. These comments were certainly unusual and suspicious.
Police bring Robert to the station for a formal interview.
Bob did have a very strange personality and strange mannerisms about him when he was interviewed. He didn't really show any signs of grieving. You would have expected that a man having just lost his wife would be very emotional at the time he was being interviewed, but we didn't see that with Bob Borton. He was very matter of fact. He was just so casual in talking even about finding his wife. He acted like that was just everyday thing. You know, it's just like talking about, well, what's the weather going to be like today?
Detectives question Robert about his relationship with Cindy.
He told us about, having arguments once in a while. He went in kind of a defensive mode about the questioning. When they're reacting like that, it does put up a red flag like that.
Investigators try to provoke a telling reaction out of Robert.
He didn't get upset when I accused him of being the one responsible for his wife's death. He didn't show sadness. He didn't cry.
His stoic but unemotional denials only increased their suspicions.
At that point in time, Bob Borton couldn't be held at all. We had no evidence to show that he was responsible. We had no information other than his matter-of-fact attitude.
Robert provides fingerprint samples, but with nothing concrete linking him to the murder, investigators must let him go.
This, frankly, was frustrating to some of the investigators involved in the case.
Cindy's body has been sent to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. While police wait to learn a specific time of death, they look to verify Robert's whereabouts.
His boss alibied him for the time that he said that he was at work that day.
Knowing it's still possible Robert killed Cindy when he went home on his lunch break at noon, what his boss tells detectives next rings alarm bells.
He changed his clothes when he went back to work.
Before the body was found, he dropped off his work clothing. It was laundered before investigators had an opportunity to examine it for blood spatter.
Had this all been part of Robert's well-executed plan?
There isn't always transfer of blood from a victim to a perpetrator, even in an extremely bloody killing such as this one. But of course, the likelihood that there would be made it important to examine the clothing, and that was impossible because those clothes, as it happened, were very quickly laundered.
That certainly was a little detail that made us think that it was him.
Investigators conducted a great deal of background interviews with neighbors, friends, co-workers.
We did look into the relationship between Robert and Cynthia Borton to see if there was a good marriage. And we did determine that they did have some problems. Everything wasn't roses and everything wasn't as you might think.
There was quarreling in the house. We thought maybe he had a lot of rage that he wanted to get rid of, and he was taking it out on Cindy. But we had never been called there for family disturbance or anything.
Needing to verify information about Cindy and Robert's relationship, detectives seek out their son, John, but the teen has vanished.
On the day she passed, all I did was shut down. My best friend, Jim, and his mother and father came driving by in their car and attempted to speak with me. I was not in the mood to talk. And then I just kept on walking.
When John arrives back home that night, detectives are there waiting.
They wanted everything that I could tell them while it was still all fresh in my mind. My father and I were still of the impression that it could have been accidental.
When asked about his parents' relationship, John admits there were problems.
There was some disagreements and a little bit of an argument, and then they realized that could I actually find anybody better for me? The answer they came up with was no, so it's like we were happy one time. We need to figure this out, get it worked out. That whole part of the wedding vows of till death do us part, they both took that very seriously.
John is too upset to say much more. Police end their conversation, but plan to talk with him again when he's less distraught. Officers are then dispatched to canvass the area around the Borton home.
They talk to the neighbors and try to find out if there's anybody who witnessed anything suspicious.
A neighbor had seen a teenager running away from the home that day, actually in the afternoon.
The neighbor's description of the teen sounds strikingly familiar.
John Borton, Cynthia's son, fit the description of the person that had run away from the house.
Had John come home early from school to murder his own mother?
It was a fascinating story. It was a mystery. He seemed like your typical teenager.
Bob Borton and also John Borton were the main and only suspects.
That in itself was the shocking part.
Detectives investigating the vicious slaying of Cynthia Borton have two prime suspects. Her husband Robert, who found her dead, and now their 18-year-old son, who matches the description of a teen seen fleeing the area around the time of the murder.
John Borton, even though he was scheduled to have been at school that day, might have come home early. So John Borton early on was a person that we wanted to talk with and get more details about where he was on that day.
The day after the murder, John is brought to the police department for another interview.
They started with the questions about the home life and everything else. I told them my mother was literally my whole world.
When detectives asked John about the last time he saw his mother, he makes a startling admission.
John indicated in his interview that he had had an argument with his mother that morning. That, of course, was interesting and relevant information.
Mother and I did disagree because I was not in the mood to go to school that day. My last words to my mother that day were a bit harsh. I have zero pride or pleasure that I can take from that particular morning.
John maintains he was at school the entire day, but he didn't have any classes between noon and 3 p.m., the approximate window of time when detectives suspect Cindy was murdered.
The whole tone of the investigation changed. They were considering me personally to be a suspect. Who on earth could think that I would do this to my mother?
In a household with three people, the two surviving occupants would always be interviewed and looked at to see if they had an alibi.
We tried to determine with anybody at the school to make sure that they saw him there and to make sure that he was in fact in school, not just that he was supposed to be in school, but that people actually did see him there during that day.
Investigators took aside two of John's friends, Jim and Jackson, to find out if there was anything that might cause them to be concerned about John as a suspect.
The teens can't confirm John was at school the entire day, but they're adamant he's not the killer.
One of the first people to console him about his mother's death was Jim Bettis.
Friends of John Borton said Cynthia Borton's murder had been true devastation for John.
I heard some of my teachers kind of speaking in kind of a low, hushed tone thing, that the detectives had come by and questioned them as to whether or not I was actually at school. Could anybody verify that I was there all day like I was supposed to be? Eventually, they were able to reconstruct my alibi for the entire afternoon.
Detectives talked with his teachers who verified that he had spent that full day at school.
Cynthia's son John is ruled out as a suspect. 3 days later, the autopsy report comes in, and police look for any insight into what exactly happened that gruesome day.
Cindy suffered a horrifying death. The medical examiner found that Cindy had been stabbed 29 times with at least 4 different instruments, 2 knives and 2 serving forks. In addition to stab wounds that directly led to her death by puncturing vital organs, she had defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. She struggled with her assailant. She had to know that she was dying at the hands of her killer.
The autopsy report also provides a detail crucial to the investigation.
Based upon his finding of a stomach full of completely undigested spaghetti, the medical examiner estimated the time of death as 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Cindy and Robert had shared a meal of spaghetti between 12 and 1 o'clock. Robert placed himself in that home alone in his wife's company at the estimated time of death.
It really made Bob Borton our prime suspect. He was the husband that last saw her alive. He was the husband that was the first to find her dead on the kitchen floor. He and his wife had had difficulties throughout their marriage, had problems.
Investigators decided that it was important to keep working on Robert. He was really their only feasible suspect.
Based on the findings of the autopsy report and mounting circumstantial evidence, Robert is called back in for another interview.
One of our agents was very aggressive in interrogating Bob Borton about his wife's murder and accusing him of being the murderer. And Bob, again, sat very calm and still and was not irate about being accused of having taken his wife's life. The investigators decided to give me a call and ask me to conduct a polygraph examination of Bob Borton and do that right away before he had a chance to think twice about it. The relevant questions that I've asked Bob Borton is, were you responsible for your wife's death? Did you cause your wife's death? Did you stab your wife? He was just very humdrum, very relaxed, and very, well, I guess, you'll have to do what you have to do because I didn't do it.
The polygraph results tell a different story.
He failed the polygraph. The results were that he was lying and that he was culpable in this crime. So investigators were, in fact, increasingly convinced that Robert had killed his wife.
One week after the gruesome murder of Cindy Borton, her husband Robert, the prime suspect in her murder, has just failed a polygraph.
When I did see those results, the thing that next happens is for me to go in and interrogate him and try to determine why he was being deceptive. I needed to try to get a confession from him. When I confronted him with the results of the polygraph examination, he didn't shake his head no that he didn't do it. He didn't try to respond to me in any way, shape, or form. He just basically sat in a chair and didn't move. The only thing I want him to say is, I did it. And so we were very aggressive in interrogating Bob Borton about his wife's murder.
Robert Borton never wavered in his denial that he was responsible for this.
Robert's behavior under questioning becomes even more unusual.
He did, in fact, fall asleep in the chair. The only time that anybody has ever fallen asleep in the middle of one of my interrogations. Bob Borton's reactions were not what we would have considered to be normal.
Despite failing the polygraph, the evidence against Robert is purely circumstantial, so detectives have no choice but to let him go.
At that point in time, we're thinking we must have missed something. There must be something more involved that we're not aware of.
The lack of an arrest unsettles the town further.
The people of the community really are concerned when there is an immediate suspect, why that person's not apprehended and taken to jail. But we need more information. We need more evidence.
The members of the community were increasingly convinced that Robert had killed his wife. They expressed those concerns. They brought a great deal of pressure on the chief of police.
The public was just as anxious to get it solved as the police was. We wanted to get this case cleared up so gossip and things would die down after, of course, this happened. He wasn't preaching for a while, and then people just quit attending.
There was a real change my father noticed. People who were open and friendly with him, all of a sudden, they quite often would go as far as to cross the street so that they would not have to walk near him, would not have to speak with him. I did my best to at least attempt to continue my life as well as I could.
Laying Cindy to rest is tough on the young teen.
The only time I can remember my mother having a brand new dress was the one bought for her to bury her in. It's the only brand new dress I ever recall her having.
2 months after Cindy's murder, Robert and John leave Shenandoah.
It was unbearable for my father to continue to live there. People who he thought had been friends before had shut him out.
He moved to a town 3 hours away, and we watched his movements, where he went, who he was meeting with.
The police were really struggling because they had nothing. They had no one else.
2.5 months later, when the state crime lab sends investigators the results of the fingerprint analysis, they hope it'll be the crucial evidence for which they've been waiting.
Robert's fingerprints were not found on any of the murder weapons or the phone. This, frankly, was frustrating to some of the investigators involved in the case. It was solid evidence that someone other than Robert Borton was very possibly the guilty party in this murder.
The news is a huge blow to the investigation.
It's concerning whenever cases are not immediately solvable, and as time passes, the prospects for solving them become smaller and smaller.
We just waited for authorities to make an arrest. And when they didn't make an arrest in the months that were going by, that's when we started to realize this is somebody that they don't know who it is.
3 months after the murder, as detectives redouble their efforts to unearth new suspects, another crime in Shenandoah comes to their attention.
In the weeks preceding and following the murder of Cindy Borton, there were arsons in the town of Shenandoah. Even though arson is a different crime than murder, it's a violent crime. And when one has a series of violent crimes, in this case, the arsons and the murder, all occurring within a matter of weeks, it would be only normal to at least examine the possibility of a connection between the two.
On November 30th, another arson occurs, and a clue found at the scene leaves investigators stunned.
The arsonist left a note referring to the 2 prior arsons and Cynthia Borton, and in fact threatened more violence in that community, saying that the arsons and Cindy Borton ain't nothing compared to what's coming.
Oh my gosh, this story just got even more crazy and more sensational and more scary.
Detectives hunting the killer of Cindy Borton have just received a mysterious clue linking her murder to a series of arson fires across town.
There was a note that was, in fact, very intriguing, and the note referred to all three arsons and Cindy Borton, obviously raising the possibility that the perpetrator of the arsons was also the perpetrator of the Cindy Borton murder. The note in question was signed the Night Stalker, NS, which copied the name of a highly publicized murderer in California.
At the time, the Night Stalker had already been arrested, so this was clearly a copycat killer.
It was rather apparent that the perpetrator was someone who used that name out of convenience and imitation.
He was calling himself the Night Stalker. Wow, he's just crazy.
There were a great many different and wild rumors, leaving notes at the scene and hints such as the NS Night Stalker were quite possibly a cry for attention. This would have to be investigated. The note was examined for fingerprints, and indeed some latent fingerprint ridge detail was found on the note.
The prints are sent to the crime lab for analysis.
It was important not only to continue investigating the murder, but also to investigate the arsons for purpose of developing a suspect on the murder. There had been 3 arsons in the community. One had been at the Broad Street School. The letters NS were found slashed on a bridge near the Broad Street School fire.
There was another fire set in a school teacher's pickup, and there was a note, "The Night Stalker strikes again."
This case was a genuine whodunit. Even though we had the Night Stalker note, investigators didn't know who had authored it or who had committed the arsons.
I never really would have expected this case to go where it went. You know, it wasn't something that we expected from the beginning at all.
Several days later, detectives get the fingerprint results from the note, and they don't match back to anyone in their database.
There was, in fact, a killer at loose in their community.
As every week went by, and then the months, we kept wondering, why is it so hard to capture a murderer in this small town who committed a murder in such a shocking, unbelievable manner?
On January 31st, 1989, police finally get a break in the case.
5 months after this murder, a young man named Jackson, a high school student, came into the police department and informed authorities that the previous day he'd had a visit from a friend, another teenager, and that in the course of their afternoon visiting with each other, this friend had told him that he had some very shocking information and something that was bothering him. More specifically, that he had murdered Cynthia Borton. This information was a shock that shed an entirely new light on the investigation.
When Jackson came into the Shenandoah Police Department, yes, that definitely was a big break. His friend had told him things that happened at the crime scene that only the killer would know.
Jackson's friend described the murder that he had committed and even went so far as to draw a small diagram indicating exactly where the body had been left in the house. Jackson shared this drawing as well with the authorities, which was important and surprising because it appeared quite accurate.
He told Jackson, "I'm going to show you where the knife is." And he did that. And that's when Jackson realized, oh, he's really done this. And later that day, even though he was sworn to secrecy, he thought about his own mom and how the killer had been a guest in their house, and he thought, wow, that could have been my mom. So it wasn't hard for him to go to the police after that.
At this point, investigators were aware that Jackson had indeed very likely spoken to Cindy Borton's murderer.
Jackson said that James Bettis was the one responsible for killing Cynthia Borton.
Jim Bettis was a close friend of John Borton. They were classmates until Jimmy dropped out of high school. He was close enough to John and interacted with the Bortons so much that Cindy was very involved in Jim's life. He even thought of Cindy as a second mother to him. She tried to help him, tried to persuade him to return to school and get an education. She was a very good friend and mother figure to the young man. Jim was certainly not a suspect up to this point, but his statement to Jackson rang true.
It was amazement at that point in time because we talked to James Bettis previously. James Bettis became the prime suspect because of his admissions to his friend, but we need more corroboration. Jim was taken to the Shenandoah Police Department and he was interviewed. Jim did confess to the arsons, as a matter of fact, but denied ever having said anything to Jackson about Cynthia Borton's murder or having any involvement in Cynthia Borton's murder.
Jim agrees to have his fingerprints collected. He's also willing to undergo a polygraph.
During the polygraph examination, the questions I would ask were, was he involved in the death of Cynthia Borton, specifically whether he was the one that committed the crime.
Jimmy Bettis insisted throughout that he did not kill Cindy Borton.
When I quantified the polygraph examinations and I actually gave a numerical figure to each of his reactions, if they're over a -6, that strongly indicates to us that he's deceptive. James Bettis came up a -23. So there is absolutely no question he was the one involved in Cynthia Borton's murder.
It was a big shock, and it really left us, and I think everyone, scratching their head. Wow, we didn't see that coming.
5 months after the horrific slaying of Cindy Borton, detectives get their biggest break when her son's friend fails a polygraph.
Jim Bettis' polygraph, according to Agent McCleary, showed deception on his denial that he had murdered Cindy Borton.
It was very unusual that all of a sudden this person would become a suspect who was a teenager, and also he was good friends with Cynthia's son. And he had been in Cynthia's house many occasions.
Investigators confront Jim with the results.
The very next thing I said was, we all know exactly what happened on September 6th. You were the one responsible for having killed Cynthia Borton. There's no question in anybody's mind now. And he came out and said, I did it. Okay, I did it.
Jim Bettis had not been on our radar at all. We never dreamed that he might be capable of something like this.
James Bettis told me that on September 6th of 1988, he was walking around town, he was thinking about his father. He was thinking about how he hated his father.
His dad was always telling him that he was no good, he wasn't going to amount to anything. It was terrible. He hated his dad.
He needed to be able to get that rage out. How he was going to do that was by seeing if he could actually kill.
His statement was that he wanted to kill his father, but that he knew he couldn't get that job done, and so he killed someone who was far more vulnerable, and that Cynthia Borton was a victim of convenience.
Police believe Jim showed up at the Borton household, just narrowly missing Robert, who had gone back to work after lunch.
Cynthia Borton answered the door and allowed him to come in because he had been there many times previously.
During his confession, Jimmy Bettis indicated that he had asked Cindy for a glass of water, which led her to walk into the kitchen. He followed her there, approaching her from behind, and grabbing a knife, immediately slashed her throat from behind. He stated he had used a pocket knife of his own in addition to Cynthia Borton's kitchen utensils. And that after the crime, he took his pocket knife, stained with Cindy Borton's blood, and threw it under a bridge. This was important information. It would corroborate his confession if in fact that knife could be found, and if in fact it had Cindy Borton's blood on it. Investigators scoured the area, found the knife where Jimmy Bettis described that they would find it, and when it was tested at the laboratory, indeed it had not only Cindy Borton's blood, but also Jimmy Bettis's fingerprint.
On February 2nd, 1989, detectives charge 18-year-old Jim Bettis with first-degree murder and 3 counts of arson.
The investigator told me that Jim had been arrested and he had confessed repeatedly. My first response was, no, he did not do this. He was my best friend. He was the first person that I trusted that was not an actual blood relative. It occurred to me that in at least some way I am responsible for this because I am the reason that he came into my house, that he was accepted into my house, and my mother is gone. There is nothing I can do to get her back.
At trial, Jim is convicted, and on November 13th, 1989, he's sentenced to life in prison.
Jimmy Bettis was a very troubled and angry and rage-filled young man. Had this crime not been solved when it was, there's every reason to be concerned that there would have been more fires, if not more murders.
My best friend committed this heinous crime of murder against somebody who trusted him, supported him, and cared for him. He frequently told me that we were brothers forever, and I honestly felt the same thing for him. And then for him to turn around and do such a horrific action, there is a bit of relief knowing that he will never be out again for the rest of his life. I want as many people as possible to know and understand what a wonderful, wonderful person my mother was, which is why I share her with as many people as I possibly can. I only miss her on days that end in Y. I am still waiting for my pain to go away. I don't know that it...
In her later years, family and business weren't the only things in Ann's life. Several months before her death, Ann had met retired eye surgeon Dr. Bob Fenneman.
Dr. Bob lived in Evansville, Indiana, about 50 miles from Madisonville. When she and Dr. Bob first started dating, she said, well, I've got a boyfriend. The very last thing that Anna Mae acted like was an old lady. When I found out that she was murdered, that just totally shocked me.
At the crime scene, detectives examined the rest of the house for clues.
There were no signs of forced entry into her residence.
Nothing was ransacked, like somebody was searching for something. We didn't have any idea who had committed such a violent act on an 85-year-old woman.
What kind of animal is this person?
While forensics continue their work, detectives speak to the 2 men who alerted police, her fiancé Bob and her brother Earl.
Earl was asked to establish a timeline for that Sunday, and he had provided an alibi where he was with family at the time of the murder, and the family did substantiate his whereabouts.
What about Ann's fiancé? Could he have had a reason to harm her?
A homicide of this magnitude, you need to ask who's in a relationship with this victim. When we interviewed Dr. Bob Fenneman, he was emotionally distraught.
Dr. Bob did ask Ann to marry him. She did accept his 3-carat diamond ring, but she had not set a date. They had talked about whether they would have some sort of agreement because she did have a lot of money, but she was kind of hesitant.
Police want to know, had Ann's hesitancy about Bob caused him to turn against her in a violent rage?
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing to inflict that many injuries. This was a personal crime.
Coming up, buried secrets are brought to light.
We all thought he was a family man, thought he was a churchgoer.
She explained that her alibi had been coerced.
While detectives unearth suspects with violent pasts.
He had several assaults in his past.
We're starting to think, hey, this could be our guy.
They had already stabbed another woman. We would never have dreamed who the killer was.
Detectives are investigating the horrific murder of elderly millionaire Ann Branson. Forensics suggests it was a crime of passion.
Dr. Bob, even with his age, we did feel could be a viable suspect.
Dr. Bob was from Evansville, and he drove all the time to Madisonville to court Ann, but she had not yet decided whether she was going to get married.
Had Ann's reluctance turned Bob against her?
Dr. Bob Fenneman was asked to establish a timeline and provide us with an alibi.
The day before Miss Branson was murdered, she had gone to Evansville, Indiana, to meet up with Dr. Fenneman to go to a dance. And after the dance, Miss Branson returned to Madisonville.
Sunday, he said he attempted to call her and she didn't answer the phone.
It was shortly before 10 o'clock that evening, and Dr. Fenneman said that he presumed that she had gone out or that she had gone to bed early.
So the next day, he said he became worried, and he said that's when they discovered the body at the bottom of the staircase.
Detectives learned from speaking to her family that Ann had been to an evening church service on Sunday.
Miss Branson's estimated time of death was on that Sunday evening after she returned home from church. Dr. Bob said that he was at home in Evansville, Indiana.
Taking no chances, investigators search his phone records.
Phone calls placed Dr. Bob in Evansville, Indiana, so he would not have been in the area during the time frame of the murder. He did not have the opportunity to murder her. It just wasn't feasible for him to have committed the crime.
After clearing Bob as a suspect, they ask if he can think of anyone who would harm his fiancée.
Dr. Bob recalled that her handyman, Wayne Shelton, had borrowed money from Miss Ann in the past, and the amount was more than what a handyman should be borrowing from his employer. Mr. Shelton also owed child support. He was trying to provide the court system a statement that she would guarantee his employment, and Miss Branson did not feel that she could guarantee him employment. So she had concerns over it.
The fact that the maintenance man had a financial relationship with the victim made him a person of interest that we wanted to talk to.
Detectives contact Wayne Shelton and ask him to meet them at Ann's house.
Wayne Shelton came to the crime scene when we were there, and I explained to him the circumstances of what had occurred. He was extremely shaken. He was in disbelief.
Police cut to the chase and ask Wayne where he was on the night Ann was murdered.
His alibi was he was in another county visiting with his daughter during the murder of Ann Branson.
Knowing Wayne's alibi is weak, detectives take him to the station for a polygraph. But there's just one problem.
Wayne Shelton had a heart condition. It was so fragile that it kept him from even being able to take a polygraph.
So the polygraph examiner refused to give Mr. Shelton a polygraph.
Frustrated by this setback, Ann's nephew, Jack Branson, a retired FBI officer, pulls some strings.
Mary and I hired a retired FBI polygrapher, and Wayne Shelton said, yes, I'll be polygraphed.
Jack's polygrapher takes Wayne Shelton carefully through the test questions.
Wayne Shelton passed the polygraph with flying colors. So at that point, we were able to say, okay, he passed the polygraph. He did not do it.
As investigators search for new suspects, news of the savage murder puts the whole town on edge.
This had been a little town where literally people didn't lock their doors. And all of a sudden, everyone was a suspect and everyone was afraid.
The community needed to know if they had something to fear. So it was pressure all the way around to get this crime solved.
As word spreads, police begin to receive tips from the public.
We received a tip that there was a black pickup truck at the residence after 12 at night.
Could the black truck belong to the killer? Investigators ask Ann's family if they know anyone who drives such a vehicle.
We kept hearing about a crazy tenant that drove a black truck.
What detectives learn about Ann's tenant concerns them.
Robert Prince had characteristics of a mentally unstable person.
He would actually call her in the middle of the night and say that he had ghosts up in his attic, and would she please get rid of the ghosts.
Anne always said she was nervous around him, and she didn't like it when he came to the house, and he called her at all hours of the day and night.
Miss Branson had received several complaints from the neighbors asking that she evict Mr. Prince from his apartment, and she did want to move him from that location.
The family would say, don't become so involved with him.
Had Anne's attempt to move Robert prompted him to attack her?
If Robert Prince was mentally unstable and became angry at her, could he have caused her death?
Detectives investigating the slaughter of Anne Branson have discovered she had been involved in a dispute with a volatile tenant.
Robert Prince would call Mrs. Branson at all hours, saying crazy things to her, wanting her to come over. They had warned her not to go over there by herself.
Due to his mental instability, he did pose a great concern for us to investigate.
Searching their database, detectives find alarming information about their new suspect.
Robert Prince was found to have had a violent criminal history. He had several assaults in his past, and he could express a lot of anger towards someone else.
Police obtain a warrant to search his home.
What we were looking for is the murder weapon. I'm looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones and go completely through the victim's body. And I'm looking for any clothes. There's no way that the perpetrator did this without getting some of the blood on himself. But we weren't able to locate any of the items that would be of interest to us in this case.
Despite the lack of physical evidence, detectives bring Robert Prince into the station for questioning.
When he was taken from his residence and interrogated, he did not want to answer any questions to do with his prior criminal history. And upon initial confrontation with Robert Prince, he was extremely agitated.
As he starts talking, we're picking up on his violent tendencies. We're starting to think, hey, this could be our guy.
Detectives note that Robert's right arm is injured.
Even though he's a man that could inflict this kind of punishment, he can't bend his right arm. And we asked him, so you right-handed or left-handed? He said, I'm right-handed.
Detectives wonder, could Robert have hurt his arm attacking Anne?
He said he was in another state at the estimated time of death for Miss Branson.
Robert Prince gave the alibi that he was with some family in Tennessee and that he had stopped in a convenience store and got some gas and got a soda or something.
With nothing concrete linking Robert to the homicide, police have to let him go, and detectives get to work checking his alibi.
We contact that convenience store, pull surveillance video, and lo and behold, there's Robert Prince on camera.
And in addition to that, prior to Miss Branson's murder, Robert Prince had surgery to his elbow area and his arm, and according to his doctor, if he had inflicted those injuries upon Miss Branson, then all of his staples and his stitches in his arm would no longer be intact. So the alibi and surgical area just ruled him out as a suspect.
Back at square one, detectives are relying on the autopsy to break open new leads.
The autopsy revealed that Mrs. Branson was stabbed about 97 times throughout her body. Her skull was pulverized. She was beaten so badly that a lot of the stab wounds were actually inflicted after she had passed away.
The evidence technician said that we're not talking about just a regular old steak knife. It's something that's very heavy because the blade is going through her bones, through her organs, and was coming out on the other side.
While the autopsy fails to identify an actual murder weapon, it gives a clear estimate of Ann's time of death.
There was a pot on the stove, which she had baked her supper. She had eaten. We were able to analyze the food in her stomach. And based on the absorption rate principle, the time of death for her was approximately 30 minutes after she got home from church.
It was determined that her time of death was between 7 and 7:30 p.m.
As police continue their search for the killer, Ann's family struggles with her death.
Mary and I walked over to Earl's house to see how he was dealing with the grief. And his son, Russell, took us in to see Earl.
The whole family was in shock, and everyone was just questioning who could have possibly done this.
Earl and Russell, they were both saying, we'll be glad when we found out who did this. And we understood that was exactly how we were feeling.
As the family grieves, Madisonville residents question whether their town really is the best town on earth.
When the town found out that Miss Branson had been murdered, it scared a lot of people because you would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around to have done that.
This is Madisonville, Kentucky, coined best town on earth. You cannot have an unsolved murder of one of its most prominent members. It can't happen.
As detectives contemplate their next move, an unexpected tip sends the case in a new direction.
We're day 4 or 5 into this investigation, but we have nothing strong yet. And then we get a phone call.
That was the pivotal turning point.
The caller is a local mine worker named Jeff Hibbs.
Jeff Hibbs has some information about one of Anna Mae's nephews, Russell Winstead.
That phone call basically shocked and rocked our investigation.
Five days after the bloody murder of 85-year-old Ann Branson, police are contacted by a man named Jeff Hibbs, who makes a stunning allegation.
Jeff Hibbs believed that Russell Winstead had some involvement with the murder of his aunt, Anna Mae Branson.
Russell Winstead was known as a coal miner, a hard worker. He had 3 sons. He was married to Terry Winstead. It was known that he and his family attended church regularly.
Jeff claims that Russell has a secret unknown to his family.
Jeff Hibbs told us that Russell Winstead had an extreme gambling addiction.
He also tells detectives that he'd gone gambling with Russell a few nights before Ann's murder.
Russell told Jeff he had gotten a loan from his aunt that he had to repay by Monday morning, and that he had $9,700, and he lost every single penny of that money.
Russell told Jeff that they're all going to know about his gambling addiction because his aunt is going to expose him for borrowing money from her on a regular basis and not paying it back.
Jeff tells police that on Monday, the local headlines grabbed his attention.
Jeff Hibbs reads about this old lady that got murdered in Madisonville.
And he's like, oh my gosh, this is the aunt that Russell had to repay by the first of the week.
Detectives go back to Ann's house to search for evidence.
On our second search, I found a ledger and the large amount of loans that was written down for one nephew. They totaled up almost $100,000. The day before her murder, she had actually written down that he had received $9,700 from her and that he had paid her a check for $12,000.
Detectives believe that Russell had given Ann a check in hopes of winning enough at the casino to cover it. But when the check is nowhere to be found, detectives subpoena his bank records.
Upon the financial investigation, it was determined that Russell was basically shifting money around to cover the loans from his aunt. And the missing check for the $12,000 never cleared the bank.
10 days after the homicide, detectives interview Russell Winstead.
Even when we told him that Miss Branson had put it in her ledger, Russell still denied any knowledge of that check. He denied having any involvement in this whatsoever. At the time of death, Russell explained that he had gone to church and that upon leaving church, he had dropped his children off at his ex-wife's house, and then that he was at home in the basement.
Russell said he got home about 7:25 p.m.
With Ann's time of death estimated between 7 and 7:30 p.m., detectives interview Russell's wife, Terry, to verify his alibi.
Terry's explanation for Russell was down to the minute.
She said, yeah, we went to church. We drove separate. He dropped his son off at his ex-wife's house, and then he got home 7:25.
Russell had a solid alibi. His wife told the exact same story he did as to where Russell was on the night of Mrs. Branson's death.
There's just one loose end for detectives to tie up: Russell's casino visits.
I asked, you know Russell gambles, right? And she's like, yeah, I know he gambles. I was like, on a bad night, what do you think he loses? And she's like, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000. I was like, try 38,000 on one night. And then she started bawling.
This was just devastating to her because she trusted Russell.
That same day, police get a search warrant for Russell's home.
We didn't find the murder weapon. We didn't find any clothes that were bloodstained. But we did recover a couple of our cell phones that his wife didn't know even existed.
One of the cell phones was only used to contact a waitress at one of the casinos.
Russell had a girlfriend who worked at the casino.
So we talked to the waitress, and it alarmed us somewhat that even after he's a suspect of interest in a murder case, Russell was still continuing to go to the casino, still trying to be the high roller.
Russell has plenty of secrets, but do money problems and infidelity make him a killer?
Russell's father, Earl, told me the police are trying to jam Russell up because they need a suspect and they want to solve this case.
When we found out that Russell had been living a literal double life, we were shocked. But we felt that there was no way Russell had not done this. We believed it with all of our hearts.
But as they dig deeper into Russell's gambling, detectives find evidence of a man out of control.
We come with a total of 236 times that Russell had visited a casino in the last year, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in that time frame.
When it's rolled up into one, you're just like going, who is this guy?
The scope of Russell's betrayal prompts his wife, Terry, to kick him out of the house and return to police with a damning admission.
Terry explained that her alibi had been coerced.
She said that Russell is the one that told her what to say.
She explained that Russell actually did not come home around 7:30 p.m., that it was more like 9. So that put him as being a person that could have committed this murder.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Russell's arrest, but when they go to bring him in, they're in for a shock.
Russell Winstead had fled the country. We were very concerned that he would not be brought to justice.
When I found out that Russell Winstead had fled, it was my goal to get him, no matter what the cost, manpower, what it took.
The prime suspect in the murder of Ann Branson is her nephew, Russell Winstead. But before investigators can make an arrest, Russell goes on the run.
For Russell to have fled the country, it was shocking to all of us.
An innocent man doesn't flee like that. This is the last straw, and he has to come back.
I have never been a person that takes waiting very well, and our son came up with the idea of putting this case on America's Most Wanted.
If you've seen Russell Winstead, please call our hotline tonight, 1-800-CRIME-TV.
They aired the show February of 05, and then in May of 05, Russell was spotted at a casino in Costa Rica.
He was living under a pseudonym. He was still bouncing from female to female, and he was living the lifestyle that he attempted to live here.
We knew where he was. We wanted justice.
There's just one problem. With Russell facing a potential death sentence at home, Costa Rican authorities refuse to hand him over.
Costa Rica will not extradite anyone to the United States where the death sentence is a possibility. And also, they have gambling. So Russell had done his homework big time.
While investigators strategize how to get Russell back to Kentucky, they make a troubling discovery.
We found out that Russell's father, Earl, had been providing Russell with monies for his lifestyle in Costa Rica.
We had a guy come forward that said that Earl was actually paying him to wire money via Western Union to Russell in Costa Rica. We believed Earl was actually aiding and abetting Russell's flight.
With Earl sending his son proceeds from the estate of the person he murdered, it basically rubbed salt in the wound. It turned your stomach.
Investigators set up a sting to catch Earl red-handed.
So we wired this guy up as a confidential informant, and he met Earl, wired the money, and we got Earl doing that 2 or 3 times.
It was verified that Earl was sending money to Russell in Costa Rica.
While investigators find no evidence that Earl was involved in his sister Ann's murder, they arrest him for helping his son evade justice.
It really struck all of us by surprise. The thought that Russell Winstead's father, Earl Winstead, was sending money down to live on in Costa Rica just sat like a burr under a saddle with me.
I remember Earl being led out in handcuffs because he was arrested for helping a fugitive. But what really hurt us deeply was the fact that we knew it was Ann's money that was paying for her murderer.
Earl eventually pleads guilty to 7 counts of hindering apprehension.
He was placed on probation for 2 years, and if he contacted Russell at any point during those 2 years, then he would have to serve jail time.
While Earl faces legal trouble at home, federal authorities move in on Russell in Costa Rica.
Russell was observed at the gambling casinos. They felt that that was probably the safest place for them to take him into custody. So as Russell was leaving the gambling casino in Costa Rica, he was apprehended.
He was arrested in May of 2005 in Costa Rica. We did not get him back to Kentucky until February of the following year. Extraditing someone back from another country takes a lot of time, and federal authorities had to make assurances that we would not seek the death penalty against Russell.
It took us 7 months to extradite him back to the United States.
To know that it was taking this long was very hard. In fact, every time we'd visit a cemetery where Emma is buried, I'd say, "We're gonna get him. We're gonna get him." It was a long, slow process.
Finally, more than 3 years after Ann's murder, Russell Winstead is returned home to face trial for the murder of his aunt.
That day I'll never forget. I went back to Anna Mae's grave and said, "We got him." And I felt like a burden had been lifted because we knew what justice was going to be done.
Upon Russell's return to Kentucky, we were preparing for a trial when we got another humongous bombshell as far as our investigation is concerned.
Someone who was also charged with murder of an elderly lady came forward saying that he was the one who had killed Mrs. Branson.
All of this evidence has been stacking up against Russell Winstead. And here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
The confession is contained in a letter posted from Hopkins County Jail. by an accused murderer named Fred Roulette.
Fred Roulette basically gives detailed information on the murder of Ann Branson that was never publicly made known. He stated that the murder weapon was a Bradis hammer. It is a mining tool, and he advised that he had modified that.
Fred Roulette provided a drawing of Mrs. Branson's home, and it was eerily accurate.
He gives all of these details that only the killer would know. I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Police have arrested Russell Winstead for the brutal murder of his aunt, Ann Branson. But now accused murderer Fred Roulette has confessed to the crime, leaving investigators reeling.
Fred Roulette was also charged with murdering an elderly lady. So you think, oh my gosh, did we get it wrong?
It was completely devastating. So we were determined we were going to find out the circumstances of his confession.
Investigators throw all their resources into checking the validity of Fred's confession.
Fred was a drug addict, and he could not provide the details of the murder and robbery that he himself had committed to the level of detail that he provided about Mrs. Branson's case.
When investigators check the jail records, they discover a telling detail.
Fred did not come forward until after Russell had been extradited back to Kentucky, and Fred Roulette and Russell Winstead were cellmates.
Already facing 25 years on a separate murder charge, Fred Roulette insists to detectives that he killed Ann Branson.
Fred didn't realize until we told him that if he wanted to confess to this murder, it now packed a death penalty. After Fred heard those words, he was like, oh, no, game's off, gig's up.
That's when he told investigators that he had all the intimate details of the murder from Russell Winstead. Fred Roulette was promised that his family would receive compensation since he was going to be in prison for the additional murder. So Fred Roulette agreed to take the false confession.
With Russell's deception exposed, his trial can proceed. In July 2007, 4 years after Ann's murder, a jury hears what really happened on that Sunday night in January 2003.
Mrs. Branson had loaned Russell upwards of $100,000. And Mrs. Branson notated in that ledger was that she had received that $12,000 check from Russell on Saturday as partial repayment of the loan. Russell had a large sum of money that he lost in the casino, and he made mention that he needed to pay back to his aunt on Monday. Russell knew he could not make good on that $12,000 check.
I believe that Russell Winstead was so desperate that he went over and he attempted to talk Miss Ann into tearing up the $12,000 check. When that didn't work, I believe that he lost it and that he snapped.
And that's when she started receiving all the damage to the 65 plus stab wounds to her back. We still do not know to this day how many times Ann Mae Branson was hit in the head.
He cleaned up the crime scene and he felt that he could get away with murder.
Russell Winstead is convicted of murder and first-degree robbery. He is sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
We all thought he was a family man, thought he was a churchgoer, but he was leading a secret life when he was off work. Gambling. Hid it from the family, hid it from his wife.
We would never have dreamed who the killer was. Of all the people that we could have looked around in a crowded room and said, that's the person, it would not have been the person that ended up being the killer.
When they announced the verdict, relief washed over me like Niagara Falls, a relief that this jury saw through Russell Winstead, and he did not fool them.
Finally, Miss Ann got her justice, and everybody who loved and knew her got a form of justice.
I miss Ann every day. And finally, I can think of her without thinking of her murder. I can finally think of her for who she was. Beautiful, beautiful part of our family.
Yeah, May took pride in who she was. I think she'd be happy to be remembered as someone who enjoyed life and had a good one.